God of Trash, Cultivation LitRPG by Noct. Chapter 193-200. Now that he knew there was a counterattack on its way, Rhys couldn't help but be on edge. He spent the entire next day checking over his shoulder, as if the counterattack would start at any moment. "What are you doing?" Lyra asked, as he looked around him for the 1000th time that day. Rhys shut his mouth. He shouldn't say. Bast had knocked out everyone to tell him. It was clearly meant to be secret, or something like that. "You're tired. I need a break." Lyra snorted. "I can see that. Are you tired to the point of paranoia, though? Is that why you're looking around like that?" "I dunno. I think I'm just tired," Rhys excused himself. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to forcibly reset his mental state. "Stop looking around. You're being obvious. Besides, it wasn't like the counterattack was going to happen today. Or tomorrow. Or the next day. It was probably weeks away. If he got all worked up for it now, he'd just exhaust himself long before the actual counterattack took place. Right now, he needed to invest. Invest in himself, invest in his restaurant, and invest in his underlings. Invest as if the sky was going to fall tomorrow, as if this was the last chance he'd get to grind before the final boss. He didn't know how long he had, but he had a little time, so he might as well use it to the best of his abilities. But how? He could always go seek out a few more impure wells, but that would only be a top-up on the trash tank at this point. Not that he wasn't going to do that, but it didn't seem like something to plan for, just something to pick up along the way. He could look for straw some more, but at this point, he was pretty sure the guy was majority in the alliance. The little straw effigy had laid mostly dormant, though it had mysteriously appeared on the hilt of his new sword every time he'd thrown away his old sword, probably something to do with straw being massively cursed, if he had to guess. Ernesto was still his best lead, and Ernesto was not in the Empire. Or if he was hidden away somewhere, and Rhys didn't have the time to find him. It was, unfortunately, looking like finding straw was still a future endeavor. Finalize the shops. But the shops were already at capacity. Or rather, Rhys was at capacity, so he couldn't realistically expand the shops any further. He could try teaching people his path, but he doubted people would be interested in picking up a trash path if they could pick up anything else. Also, he kind of didn't want to. Call it selfish and trashy of him, but it was a massive benefit to be the only one who was basically immune to impurities. If he made a student, and that student went rogue and they'd be a trashy student, so why wouldn't they do something trashy like decide to kill their teacher? Then he'd be the one in the most trouble. True, in this hypothetical scenario, he'd be much stronger than his student, but that was assuming things went as normal. He was a trash talent, though. If he trained a star talent, he didn't even want to imagine how powerful they could become, or how rapidly they could gain power. Anyways. His anxiety-fueled spirals aside, it would take years for someone to accumulate enough knowledge of trash to replace or even augment Rhys, so that wasn't an option with a counterattack around the corner. And anything else, expanding further wasn't really an option, and they were already as virulent as he could make them without risking getting caught as impure by every mage with half an iota of sense. The shops were in their final state. No, they weren't across the entire empire, and no, they weren't as epidemic as they could be, but they stretched a good distance into the empire, and they were as viral as he could make them. All he could do was his best, and when it came to the shops, he was comfortable saying he'd done his best. He could grow his underlings, but growing mages was a long, slow process. He'd record them all with the energy from the criminals, and more than that. Reaching Tier 2. Not realistic. Even the first ones who had joined his group hadn't reached Tier 2 yet. Even his Tier 2s were struggling to reach Tier 3, and they hadn't been recorded and had a long time to practice their paths outside of the time they'd spent in the Empire. Though, speaking of, the looks in the eyes of some of those rescued mages when he'd finally record them. He hadn't realized how close he was to mutiny. True. Seeing their friends run around with cores and use magic while they were growing older as mortals couldn't be fun, and he understood that, but from the way some of them had eyed him on return, boy, they'd been closer to their absolute limit than he'd realized. It was fortunate that between the criminals and the Tier 4 he'd absorbed, he'd been able to re-core all of them, or else he might not have had many underlings left. Not to mention the damage they could do, if they got frustrated and decided to go talk to the Empire. He couldn't imagine. They couldn't delete his entire operation, but they could do massive damage to him, and in the worst case, force him to activate his impurities before he was ready. People are dangerous, he thought to himself, shaking his head. When this was all done, he might just hare off into the wilderness and be a hermit for a while. Just spend some time on his lonesome, where there weren't any politics or interpersonal dynamics to deal with. He was someone who'd spent his entire life working from home because office politics sounded like hell. Having to deal with people now was basically his worst nightmare, except that the Empire had introduced an entire new dynamic of nightmare that he hadn't previously anticipated. He could raid more camps, but most of the camps had already been raided, and the ones that remained were deep in the heart of the Empire, even deeper than his shops could reach. He hadn't rescued everyone from his region, he didn't think, anyways, but after his big raid, the Empire had closed those camps and moved all the remaining workers and guards, the few there were, after Rhys's raids into the deeper camps. There was nothing he could do about that, not without overextending, nor did he want to create a big fuss on the eve of a counterattack. If all went well, the Empire might not exist after their counterattack, or at worst, it would exist in a weakened state, on a path toward death, and it would be easier to attack the camps after their counterattack. What else? He frowned, thinking, and then snapped, his eyes widening. The Empire's trash heaps. Its juicy trash heaps full of artifacts that were perfectly functional, but which the Empire simply disagreed with. It was time for him to go find those trash heaps, and raid the hell out of them. He barely needed to consult his longtime Empire citizens, aka the ex-criminals, to find out where they were. It turned out they were a well-known location, somewhere the entire Empire knew about, and highly guarded. It was still a trash heap of sorts, but there were guards all around it, because the Empire disagreed with the artifacts, and wanted the world to know that, but knew that they were valuable to non-Empire citizens and didn't want to give their enemies easy power. Apparently, the mana battery that Logan Waters had been using came from the heap. The problem, however, was that the heap was well known by the Empire's citizens because everyone knew it was full of valuable artifacts, the Empire, its criminal elements, outside mages, everyone. As a result, the Empire guarded its heap well. Guards patrolled it 24/7, and not weakling Tier 1 guards, either, but Tier 2s, 3s, and 4s. It would be the hardest heist he'd done so far, harder than all the camps combined, harder, even, than raiding the criminals. His eyes glittered. He grinned. But I'm up for a challenge. And if all goes right, it might even be the kind of challenge where I end up getting stronger, and maybe Lyra and Mouse too, if we're lucky. And so, Rhys set his sights, at last, on the garbage heap full of powerful artifacts from the Empire's conquest. Rhys felt like a man finally facing his truth, as if he were achieving a great thing that he had desired after for a long time. In reality, he'd just forgotten about the trash dumps for a long time and gotten distracted by a lot of other very important work, and they'd ended up falling by the wayside while he worked on all the other higher priority stuff. It was more akin to someone with a lot of projects continuously working on the most important stuff while the slightly less important projects languished, until the day finally came when the forgotten projects could languish no longer, aka the deadline, and he had to hop to and actually work on those projects. It definitely wasn't something he'd done, or rather, that he'd had to do repeatedly in his first life, definitely not. And just like in his first life, where it didn't happen, the projects he'd pushed off were really fun ones he was looking forward to a little more than everything else, but which the more important projects had forced into the backline, whether he liked it or not. Not that it happened. But now he was getting back on top of it. Now he was back in control of his destiny. From atop his destiny, he would ride it to his ultimate destination, the most delicious and dangerous trash heap of all time. You know, I never thought I'd think about that phrase as much as I ended up thinking about it, he thought to himself. The phrase, control of their destiny, had been inescapable during his college years, blaring from every television screen in the dining hall, as the college sports talking heads discussed which college team would make it to the playoffs on their own merit, rather than by deliberation of the college sports court, or whatever it was that decided who made it into the college sports playoff when the team couldn't make it into the playoffs based on their win-loss record alone. He didn't really understand the intricacies of college sports, but he could certainly hear the phrase, X team wants to control their destiny, 50,000 times. He hadn't thought about it much recently, but he had thought about it more than he'd wanted to admit back in his first life. Probably because he felt like he wasn't in control of his destiny more often than the opposite. Luckily, it's different here. Here, he definitely controlled his destiny. He controlled his destiny so much that he sometimes wished that he didn't control his destiny quite as much, because being in such complete and total control of your destiny, it turned out, was a lot of responsibility when it wasn't referring to ending up in the college football playoffs. But even so, it was way better controlling his destiny than slaving away at a shitty corporate job he hated, with no hope of escape or advancement. Responsibility was better than wanting to die every day, stuck in the rat race without an escape aside from actual death, and he hadn't wanted to die that much. He didn't want to risk his teleportation network, so he walked to the trash heap. Or rather, ran at mage speeds, which was akin to driving in a car, maximum effort style. They moved as fast as, if not faster than, cars, but he did have to run. It didn't really hurt or take much effort, like it had in his first life, thanks to his mage body and stamina, so it really did feel like driving in a car, except when he started dozing off, he might knock his head on a branch instead of drift out of the lane. The branch lost the battle. It wasn't even a fight, to be completely honest. There was a crack, splinters dusted his shoulders, and when he looked back, there was a freshly severed branch on the ground and the scent of pine sap on the air. He'd brought Mouse, for infiltration purposes, Sable, for combat, and he hadn't brought Lyra, but she was here anyways. He wasn't going to protest her presence, since he needed her and Mouse to rank up, but he hadn't sought her out for this quest, either, because it wasn't like the garbage heap was particularly close to water. She'd simply materialized when he was heading out, and he hadn't stopped her. He had, however, hesitated. Where are the new workers? The new farmers, he clarified, as if that specified any more than the first question had. He waved his hand and tried again. The most recent criminal recruits. Lyra shrugged. On their way. There's some tier 1s among them. They can keep them pointed the right way. And if they don't, I'll go put the fear of trash into them. Isn't the phrase, fear of God? Rhys asked. Yeah, but we're not here to worship any gods, she'd countered, and there wasn't much he could say to that, except for a quiet yet in his heart. Rhys touched his chest. Hold on. Do I actually believe absolute existence, somewhere deep down? Am I actually trying to become a god? On one hand, the goal of every mage was to become a god. On the other hand, Rhys had, somewhere in the back of his mind, a long-settled doubt that such a thing was possible. After all, in his old world, people who claimed to have become God were insane, cult leaders, selling something, or really good parrot trainers who were trying to start a cult, only to get countered by even better parrot trainers. Becoming a god wasn't possible. At best, it was a delusion, and at worst, it was a scam. Somewhere, in the back of his mind, he still thought of it that way. But in this world, everyone seemed to believe it was possible to actually become a god, or at least become so powerful as to be indistinguishable from an actual god. Whether or not Rhys believed in the deity part of deification, he certainly believed that mages could grow powerful enough to equate to gods, but even so, a tiny part of him had still been locked in his old worldview, unable to perceive himself as reaching godhood. And now, that seemed to be changing. He looked at his hands, then slowly closed them. Huh, you okay over there? Lyra asked. Yeah, I'm fine. So, leaving the new recruits to finish their pilgrimage solo, she joined his attack on the trash heap group. It was a long trip to the trash heap, and honestly, Rhys kind of needed that. A break. A long jog with nothing to do but look at the trees and think. And not think difficult thoughts, just wander around and think things. It had been so long since he'd had any time to just spend time on his own and not work towards some goal, whether it was the restaurants, the criminals, freeing people from camps, or other things, that it was almost confusing to be without such a driving goal. Sure, he was still heading to do a big attack on the Empire, but he knew nothing about the place he was going, or anything else, so there was nothing he could do but run there and spend time on himself. It was so relaxing that it almost put him to sleep, even when he was running. I didn't know I needed time to myself this bad, he thought, dodging the trees as they raced through the forest. Then again, he wasn't really surprised. He'd barely spoken to another living being in his first life, and he was speaking to humans and living beings nonstop over here. He was even dealing with complex human politics and layered behaviors, which were so far outside of his expertise that he was kind of amazed he was able to handle them with anything approaching grace. Not that he was bragging about his ability to handle things, not at all, and he failed to handle many things appropriately, but he had at least managed to handle them way better than average for him, and that was something he could be proud of. A quiet sound from beside him. He turned and found Mouse there. "We're getting close. Be prepared," she warned him. Rhys nodded. He took a deep breath and stored away his resting mind, putting on his fighting mind. "It's time to lock in again. Let's go." The forest fell away before them. They paused at the edge of the tree line, all of them gathered around Mouse so that her invisibility aura encapsulated all of them. 100 meters of nothing stretched before them. 100 meters of empty land devoid of trees, undergrowth, or anything else. Soldiers patrolled that land, openly walking it even now. There were 100 meters on all sides of the focal point, the object completely surrounded by empty land patrolled by Empire men. As some would call it, absolute territory, though Rhys preferred to use that term to refer to the region between a short skirt and stockings. A small stone hut stood at the center of the patrolled region. There was no glorious trash pit, as Rhys had dreamed, just a little hut, unremarkable in all ways except for its being so closely and totally patrolled. He snorted. They could have made it completely unnoticeable if they just hadn't drawn attention to it, but instead, they'd gone to all this trouble, and now it stood out more than anything else around. Of course, he didn't know the place's history. Maybe it had once been a quiet, unremarkable stone hut, and then people had repeatedly broken in, and the Empire had repeatedly counter-escalated until they grew to this point. He simply didn't know. It wasn't as if a place that held deeply valuable artifacts that were worthwhile even in a system that devalued them due to the magics imbued into their very selves would go ignored by thieves, looters, and opportunists. Hell, Rhys himself was an example of that. However, it did mean that they wouldn't just be waltzing in. He'd known it from the start, but it was one thing to know it, and another to actually see that they'd have to kill a lot of people to get there. Kill. He pressed his lips together, frustrated. It would be way better if they could sneak by, but aside from Mouse herself, he was pretty sure no one else could get through such a dense covering of soldiers. Killing them wasn't exactly a great option, either. There were too many of them. At least one of them would escape and raise the alarm. It wasn't like with the camps, where they were scattered piecemeal, and they could either take them down one at a time, or overwhelm the groups rapidly and take them down so quickly that no one else could raise the alarm. It was an open field with at least a dozen, if not 20 or more soldiers, and scattered across a 100-meter radius circle centered on the hut. It just wasn't possible for them to kill them all before one of the soldiers reported their attack, or knock them out, or anything like that. Someone would escape. Someone would raise the alarm. He needed something else. A way to put them all out at once. Put them all out at once. Rhys raised his eyebrows. Hold on. I can do this. He reached into his core and pulled out the toxic gas that had been accumulating in his core, wrapping it into a tight bundle in his palm. A marble, a billiard ball, a softball, the compressed gas ball grew larger and larger, as he continued to deeply compress the gas. It became fully opaque as he continued to add more and more gas. This time, He didn't worry about whether it was flammable or not, it was irrelevant to his plan. The ball grew to a bowling ball, and then a large balloon. Although it was opaque, swirls of green, brown, and purple-red moved around on its inside, as if they were fluid, or gas, contained within a glass ball, which was essentially what it was, except that the glass ball was his will. He looked up to judge the size of the field and found all three girls staring at him. Mouse in confusion, Sable with the same blank eyes as ever, and Lyra with open disgust. He stared back at them, then realized he hadn't said anything this entire time. He hadn't even brought up the situation before them as a problem that needed solving. Sure, it was pretty obvious that it was a problem that needed to be solved, but he hadn't addressed it. From their perspective, he stood there. Then suddenly a nasty-looking ball of strange material started forming on his palm in complete silence with no explanation at all. Rhys coughed. It's, how I'm going to deal with them. Don't worry about it. I worry about you all the time. That's not possible, Lyra said. Mouse bobbed her head in silence, then realized it looked as if she was agreeing with Lyra and blushed, looking away. No fighting? Sable asked, deeply disappointed. No, we couldn't beat them all in time, before someone raised the alarm or got away. Sable twisted her lips in displeasure, but didn't say anything else. She turned away. Rhys glanced at her. There'll be a lot of fighting in the near future. Don't worry. Sable looked up, her eyes shining. She nodded. Rhys looked at Mouse. She hesitated, then met his eyes, raising her brows hesitantly. Is there anything I need to tell you not to worry about? He asked her. Rhys sighed. Don't worry about it. Hey, there it is. You found it. Lyra cheered. Plus, I'm not 100% sure there will be no fighting. Rhys cast his gaze over the field of guards. The criminals had mentioned Tier 3 and 4 guards, but the highest he could sense was Tier 3. Admittedly, there were a few Tier 3 guards, and he wasn't confident he could smother them all in time, but there were no Tier 4s. Maybe the criminals were exaggerating, or hadn't had the best gauge on the guards themselves, being too low tier to accurately sense the guards' tiers. Rhys was pretty sure there were people who'd swear he was a Tier 4. Or maybe it was simply hearsay, but something about only seeing Tier 3 and below guards when he was warned about Tier 4s put him on edge. Or maybe I'm just on edge in general. I've been on edge since I met with Bast and learned about the counterattack, to be fair. He took a deep breath, then looked at Sable. I'm going to launch this attack. Some people might get away, or might try to run. I'm not completely confident that it will kill everyone. I need you, he lifted his gaze to encompass Mouse and Lyra, to finish off anyone who it doesn't kill. We can't have anyone get away or raise the alarm, since we're going to be here for a while. I don't know what's in that stone hut, but I suspect it isn't just a storage room. I would expect traps, attacks, and surprises. We should aim to get in and out as fast as we can, but I think we'll be in there for hours to days. Expect that, even if everything goes right, we'll have to fight our way out against a bunch of guys who were trained to do nothing but kill people coming out of that hut. Understood, Lyra said, mock saluting. Do you understand? Rhys looked around at all of them. I'm telling you not to overreach. Don't push yourself. It doesn't matter how valuable or powerful the artifact is. If you can't guarantee that you'll have the energy afterwards to break free of the soldiers, don't go after it. Lyra raised her brows. She nodded, slowly. Oh, of course, Mouse said enthusiastically, nodding. Sable harumphed. As if I wouldn't be prepared to fight. Rhys snorted under his breath. 3 very different people. He took a deep breath and looked at the ball in his hands. It had continued to grow the whole time he was talking, and was now almost as big as his torso. He looked at the dark-colored gas, then at Mouse. Mouse, crazy question. Why yes. He looked at her. Can you extend your invisibility? Stretch it out to cover an object instead of just you. Mouse jumped. She bit her lip and looked at the ground. Sorry. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. It's fine if you can't. He looked out at the field, gauging the distance from soldier to soldier, and grimaced. Yeah, it's not going to happen. Maybe if I pre-position Sable, Mouse, and Lyra, and also attack while I run the gas attack. I've never done it before, but I can try. Rhys looked at her. His eyes shone. Please. You maybe. I'll try my best. He nodded. Expect nothing, hope for the best. Sable, I need you on the opposite side. Lyra, Rhys leaned back, getting a better angle on the sight. At last, he pointed. That way. Stand that side. Civilization's over there. They'll just touch their notification amulets if this goes wrong, Lyra grumbled. In case they go stupid in their panic. Or the amulet doesn't work. Come on, Rhys said, giving her a look. Fine, I'm going. Lyra waved and started to walk off. Wait, Sable, Lyra. If this goes wrong and anyone gets past you, we flee. Got it. Lyra gave him a thumbs up. Sable scrunched her nose, but gave him a curt nod. With that, the two of them vanished into the forest, and Rhys turned to Mouse. Let's try and stretch that invisibility of yours. See how far we can push it. Why yes. He extended the orb of gas, then paused. Don't touch it. It's probably toxic to the touch. Touch me. Why you? Mouse asked, and blushed furiously. On the arm. Touch me on the arm, Rhys quickly clarified. Touch me on the arm, and channel your invisibility to cover the gas. How about that? Mouse nodded, ducking her head to hide her blush. She touched his arm, and for a moment, Rhys lost track of it. For a moment, he didn't have a right arm, and for some reason, it didn't even occur to him to wonder where his right arm had been. He'd never had a right arm. What a silly thing to have, two arms. And then Mouse's focus shifted, and suddenly he had a right arm again. Holy shit. Mouse is scary. Rhys glanced at Mouse, raising his brows. She was deeply focusing on her task, and didn't notice him reappraising her for the billionth time. If she'd meant to vanish his right arm, instead of it being an intermediate step to vanishing the gas, would he have noticed her taking it at all? Or noticed it coming back? Daily reminder not to piss Mouse off, he noted to himself. Nervously, he fed a little of the excess cursed energy in his core to the little straw, who shivered in delight, totally unaware of the fact that Rhys had forgotten about him since he was tangentially related to Rhys's right arm. At least I only forgot about little straw. But if her powers kept growing, would she be able to accidentally make him forget about big details like straw and bast? Like his old life. Rhys suppressed a shudder. When Mouse got stronger, she was going to be terrifying. It was a good damn thing she was on his side. At last, Mouse looked at him. I can do it, I think. Do what? Rhys asked. She jumped. The gas. Rhys, the gas. Rhys jumped too. Right. The gas. How could I forget? He quickly got a hold on the large ball of gas once more, then shook his head. Terrifying. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Rhys kept all his attention trained on the gas ball. It was the only way he could keep from losing track of it with Mouse's influence on it, and that was with her trying to let him in particular be aware of the gas ball under his own influence. Slowly, with Mouse's constant feedback, he stretched the gas over the sky. It blocked out the sun and colored the light pouring down from above, but none of the soldiers reacted. Sweat poured off Rhys and Mouse alike as the two of them both focused on their task. Rhys had to use all his mana control and trash manipulation to manipulate the trash gas across the entire field, while Mouse struggled to keep the entire obvious cloud hidden, or at least unnoticed. The soldiers patrolled the open land, no more aware of the impending gas cloud expanding over them. Occasionally, one paused and squinted at the sky, but then Mouse's eyebrows furrowed harder than before and her eyes flared, and the soldiers' eyes would drift away, and their feet would keep moving. The cloud spread across the entire field. Rhys strained to keep it controlled, but it was a good kind of strain. He could feel his mana control strengthening and his trash manipulation grow more powerful, even as he pushed up against the limits of what he could do now. From a torso to a 10-foot radius, to 20, 50, 100. The gas was thin by then, translucent but still thick enough to color the light. Mouse's brows unfurrowed, and she relaxed a hair. Rhys, on the other hand, kept focusing. Slowly, he lowered the gas, then all at once, yanked it down to head height. The weakest guards, the Tier 2s, immediately keeled over as the toxic gas flowed into their every orifice. The Tier 3s looked around, searching for the attack that Mouse wouldn't let them notice, then ran for it. Some ran for the hut, while others ran in the opposite direction, for the forest. None of them made it. Whichever way they went, they hit the ground before they got there. 3 guards remained. Their auras instantly surged up to Tier 4, and their heads went on the swivel, searching for the source of the attack. Rhys swirled his hand, and the remaining gas compressed into 3 tighter knots even as Lyra and Sable charged out of the forest. He kept the orbs of gas on the soldiers' heads as he himself stepped out, closing in on the closest soldier to him. Mouse, help Lyra. The soldier saw him coming and raised his sword. Rhys drew his, the compressed poison blade whipping as he pulled it from his storage ring. They exchanged blows. The soldier was experienced with the Empire's sword technique, but Rhys had fought Laurent, and he knew the style. Plus, he wasn't trying to land a killing blow. The poison eroded the man's health from the gas on his head and the little blows with the sword alike. The man had started with more strength and skill than Rhys, but Rhys wasn't fighting fair, and by the time he reached the man's strength was far lower than it had been at the start of the day. The battle was predetermined, and before long, Rhys stood victorious over the man, his blood soaking into the grass. Rhys knelt and absorbed the man, then looked at his hand. The man wasn't a strong Tier 4, but he was a Tier 4. And killing him had been easy. He closed his hand, slowly. Maybe that dream of mine isn't a dream, after all. Rhys. He looked up, sharply. Across the field, Sable fought her soldier. They were evenly matched, and it might have been a difficult battle for her if they'd been fighting as one swordsman to another, even with Rhys's poisonous help, but Sable brought another half-dozen limbs to the battle, and so the soldier was quickly finding himself on the back foot. Not her. He turned again. Mouse and Lyra struggled to distract their soldier. They weren't defeating him, but merely buying time, with Lyra flashing in and out, her blade drawing waves on the air behind her as droplets of water chased the blade, and Mouse playing backstabber, appearing for a moment to stab him in the back, then vanishing the next. The soldier was frustrated and his form sagged, but he was still at Tier 4, and the two of them, Tier 2. Their best hits were little more than papercuts to him. Right. Rhys dashed across the battlefield, stepping from body to body as Trash step lengthened his gait so he would only step on garbage. The soldier fainted, and Lyra blocked, only for him to sweep her feet. He raised his sword for the killing blow, and Mouse's back prickle wasn't enough to distract him this time. I won't make it. Rhys's gaze sharpened. He reached out, twisting his hand, and the poison lifted off the man's head and compressed, down, into a needle of impurities and filth. The man jerked back, sensing something from the needle, but it was too late. Rhys yanked his hand toward him, and the needle plunged into the man's face. Instantly, impurities began spreading through his body. The man looked around and realized at last that this was not a fight he could win, and lifted his hand to his neck, yanking out a gemstone on a chain. Messaging amulet. Mouse shouted, no time to bother with grammar or anything but the essentials. Rhys spun his hand. The needle of impurities whirled around in the man's veins and surged through his body. The man staggered, coughing in pain, and his hand stuttered, his mana twisting in his body. The needle burst out of the veins in his neck and smashed into the messaging pendant. The stone corrupted, turning dark, then shattered. The man gagged, clutching his neck. Mouse stared at Rhys in probably the same horror and shock that Rhys had been staring at her with the whole time she'd been hiding the gas cloud. Rhys kept running. Finish him. He's not dead yet. On it. Lyra swept her sword, and the man's head hit the ground. Rhys slowed. He reached them at a jog, shaking his head at the two of them. Wow. Beat a Tier 4, huh? Not really. You beat him. I couldn't even cut his flesh until you did whatever that was, Lyra said. Even if they're the Empress's men, they're still Tier 4s, Huh, Rhys said, giving the body a kick. Not sure we could have taken on 3 tier 4s. It's only because they were the Empress's men that we stood a chance at all, Lyra said, twisting her lips. Rhys nodded. She was right, after all. Real tier 4s would have techniques, secrets, spells, and who only knew what kind of body modifications built into their hundreds of years old bodies. The Empire's men had the Empire's sword techniques and the Empire's spells. He imagined it made them incredibly effective in platoons, but one-on-one, they were paper tigers. Big, scary, and impressive to look at, but nothing too dangerous in of themselves. Sable sprinted over, running on her bone limbs across the field. Rhys waited for her to make her way over, then turned to all of them. Right. I don't know how long we've got, but let's make the most of it, and be prepared to fight your way out. Got it. Nods all around. Rhys extended his aura, then pulled inward. He felt the void reaching with him, and let it pull. From all around the field, bodies, filth, and trash flew toward him, then vanished, swirling into his core. He raised his brows, a little shocked himself, but didn't try to show it. On the other hand, the girls had no such compunctions. Lyra stared, her jaw dropped, and Mouse's eyes got real big and wide. Only Sable didn't react much at all, just blinking slowly as if this was nothing special. That's something to look into later. I've never had the void pull with me before. Though, I've also never tried to draw in trash from that distance before. The last of the trash flowed into him. Rhys dusted himself off and beamed at the girls. On to the real deal, then. On to the real deal, Lyra repeated. They turned toward the small stone hut in the center of a now empty field. A strange aura emanated from the hut, something Rhys couldn't quite put his finger on, but which felt familiar. He frowned for a moment, trying to feel it out, then shrugged. The second he stepped through that door, he'd be able to figure it out one way or another. There wasn't a door. The stone hut had a kind of entrance, where the stones had a gap between them. It wasn't a large hut, and Rhys should have been able to see the entire thing from the outside, but instead, all he could see was indeterminable darkness. Darkness so deep that he couldn't see a bottom to it. It was like staring into the night sky, except there were no stars, just darkness, darkness, darkness. He ran a hand over the back of his neck. That's what it reminds me of. The void. The empty darkness. There was no door, but he knew that the second he stepped inside that darkness, he would be gone. No one would be able to see him any longer. There was no door, but that didn't mean there wasn't a barrier of some sort there. Rhys took a deep breath and stepped forward. Hiding the hesitation he felt with a smile, he turned back to the girls and beamed. Let's go, then. Rhys had to duck to fit through the opening in the hut. His vision went pitch black the second he edged inside. He walked hunched for a few moments, then stood a little and realized there was nothing over his head. Cautiously, he stood, and struck nothing all the way up. The hut had only been about 4, maybe 5 feet tall, but he was able to stand. Wherever this was, it wasn't physically inside the hut anymore. He walked forward, taking one step after another, though he wasn't sure that he was moving at all. The darkness stretched in all directions, and spread equally in front of and behind him. He could have been walking in place, and he wouldn't be able to tell. At last, a light appeared in the distance. He walked toward it, and it grew larger and larger. Experimentally, he stopped moving his feet, and the light stopped growing larger. At least I've established that I'm not walking in place. He resumed his approach. The light grew larger and brighter, until it was blinding. He held his hands over his eyes, shading them from the light. He had the sensation of passing through a door, and then brilliant light flooded the world around him. Rhys closed his eyes, squinting against the light while his eyes adjusted, then blinked, staring. This isn't inside that stone hut. Or rather, it wasn't inside at all. It was a trash heap, intimately familiar to Rhys. There was a sun, and land, at least a segment of it. The earth cut off sharply. It was a jagged chunk of land, with edges and crags, that appeared to have been yanked out of the ground and placed into this secret realm. He didn't know another term for it. Alternate dimension. A tiny world, that was nothing but a floating chunk of earth swimming in an orb of blue sky. Beyond the limits of the chunk of land stretched, nothing. The sky, but that was obviously fake. Rhys extended his senses toward it, inspecting the false sky more closely. Mana tingled at the edges of his perception, and beyond that, a familiar mind-twisting empty sensation. He raised his brows. The void. It wasn't exactly a surprise, but it was definitely what awaited beyond that vast, false blue. He hadn't seen worlds floating in the void, but how much of the void had he seen? If the void was even 1/100th the scale of space back home, then the chances that he saw another object from his starting point was minuscule. And then Rhys froze and whirled. Lyra. Mouse. Sable. He stood alone on the edge of the trash heap. There wasn't another living being in sight. He closed his eyes and extended his senses as far as he could, but he didn't sense a single person. Whipping around, Rhys turned to face the direction he'd come from, but if there'd been a door before, there wasn't one now. Nothing but the edge of the chunk of earth waited for him. You needn't worry. Your friends are safe. The hairs on the back of Rhys's neck stood on end. He whirled again to find a handsome man with greasy hair standing behind him. It was the first time he'd seen the man standing, but he recognized him anyways, the man he'd met at the Impure Well. The one he'd questioned in mornings, before he'd vanished as unceremoniously as he'd appeared. The one who knew about the void, and straw, the man who claimed to have nothing left but knowing. You said you know how to find straw, Rhys accused him, having suddenly remembered it. The man had associated himself with the void the second time they'd met, and Rhys had been so interested in that he had forgotten one of his most important quests. I do. Rhys waited, but the man said nothing else. He gritted his teeth, remembering. He hadn't spoken to the man in some time, for so long that the man had stopped appearing before him, and he'd forgotten why, but now he immediately remembered. It was because the man was an annoying asshole who didn't know how to give a straight answer to save his life. So, I don't suppose you're going to be helpful for finding the girls, either. He said, crossing his arms. I could be, the man allowed. I didn't ask if you could. I asked if you were going to or not. The world rarely proceeds in absolutes. It does more often than you like giving a straight answer. The two of them stared at one another. If I guess who you are, will you help? Rhys asked at last. The man tucked his hands behind his back. I've already told you who I am. Desmond, right. We both know that's not your real name. I mean who you really are. There was a long pause. At last, the man hummed. I'll give you one chance. If you get it wrong, then I'll do nothing, even less than I was planning on doing. If you get it right, then I'll answer one question without holding anything back, no matter what it is. You can ask me about the void, about straw, about your missing friends. If it is within my power and knowledge, then I will tell you everything I know. He lowered his head, looking Rhys in the eyes. Choose wisely. Rhys took a deep breath. He looked over the man, compiling everything he knew into one. The man had first appeared by an impure well. He was associated with the void, and knew a lot about it. He was ethereal, likely somehow disembodied or otherwise dead in the physical world, someone who could no longer use their physical body. And he knew, not where straw was, but how to find straw. This was a man for whom words meant much. He chose every word and phrase intentionally, to obfuscate, but in such a way that wasn't untruthful. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough for him to take a guess. Plus, it wasn't like Rhys was afraid of losing his help. If the man was planning to give his usual amount of help, then he'd simply waste more of Rhys's time with riddles and nonsense than if Rhys were working alone. He'd be better off either way on the other end of this gamble, whether the man simply shut up and stopped doing anything, or actually decided to start helping. It was a win-win. But he wanted to get it right. You're the Demon King, aren't you? Rhys said, looking him in the eye. A low chuckle. The man eyed Rhys from the corner of his eye. You're not afraid of looking the sun in the eye, are you? Well, Mama, that's where the fun is, Rhys replied. They stared at one another. Rhys coughed. As my homeland's famous bards were fond of saying. You're not from around here, are you? The man said. No, you could say that, Rhys said, a playful grin spreading across his cheeks. He crossed his arms and gestured at the man. How about this? Double or nothing. I'll give you one chance to guess where I'm from. If you get it right, we return to base state. You owe me nothing, and it's as if these wagers never happened. If you get it wrong, then I get 2 straight answers. What do you say? The man, or rather, the Demon King, looked Rhys up and down. I've been attached to you for longer than you know. I am aware of many of your secrets. Do you still wish to make this wager? Confidence crept into Rhys's grin. If the Demon King was bargaining, then he almost certainly didn't know, but his pride wouldn't allow him to turn down Rhys's offer wholesale, either. He cocked his head back. Go on. You're the Demon King, who knows more than I could learn in my pitiful lifespan. Certainly you know what I mean by that question, no. Certainly you can figure it out. The Demon King crossed his arms. He looked Rhys over the same way Rhys had just looked him over, and an odd light appeared in his eye. Rhys felt deeply scrutinized in a way he never had before, as if the Demon King weren't just looking at his body and physical self, not just at his mana and core, but at something deeper, something else. At last, the Demon King spoke. You're not purely of this world. There is a part of you that comes from outside. A different realm. A higher realm. Are you a child of heaven, perhaps? Rhys cracked a smile. Nope. That means 2 questions for me. The Demon King narrowed his eyes. Tell me the truth, then. What are you? I'm from a world called Earth. One with no magic. I reincarnated into this world as a child, and I've spent this entire life relearning everything I knew. There you go. The Demon King frowned slightly, but said nothing. At last, he nodded at Rhys. Your questions. How can I rescue the girls? Rhys asked, careful with his phrasing. He didn't want to give the man a chance to wriggle out of his full answer. This man was as slippery as a fae or djinn from his legends back home, and though he had no supernatural hayas requiring him to be maximally obnoxious to speak to, he seemed to get so much joy out of it that he might as well have. The Demon King spread his hands. You don't have to. They have no karma with this place, so they are unable to find it. They will wander the darkness until they wander their way back out of the stone hut. If they are foolish enough to re-enter it, they will face the same over and over again, until they give up. But I had karma with it. Rhys asked. The Demon King gave him a look. It is a trash heap, Rhys allowed, nodding. It wasn't like he was shocked to find out he had some kind of connection to this place. The place was full of trash, after all. Trash was kind of his thing. A moment later, he tilted his head. But then, the other criminals who found this place had karma with something within it. Rhys nodded. That made sense. They weren't called by the totality of this place, but by some particular artifact. It wasn't as if he wasn't familiar with the concept. There was an entire genre of trashy literature, often short stories, children's literature, or both, about shops full of mysterious artifacts that chose their owners, and he'd indulged in many of them as a child or an adult. If any of the girls arrived here, then there was an object they needed, or that needed them. If they didn't, then they simply had no use for this place. I will graciously count that information as 1 question. What else would you like to know? The Demon King asked. I want to bank that question for later. When I've had time to think over what I really want to ask. The Demon King nodded. I will graciously allow it. Fantastic. Then, can you tell me your name? I can't keep thinking of you as the Demon King. Can you give me something else? Your real name, maybe. The Demon King eyed him. You don't even know my name. Rhys shook his head. I don't know anything about you, really, except for what Bast told me as a kid, and what little I read in the libraries. Your name wasn't really mentioned. They preferred to impress upon me how terrifying you were. The Demon King shook his head. These piddling, this is what I feared. It's propaganda, not education, nowadays. The world eroded, just as I thought it would. Those fools didn't understand. They thought they fought for freedom, but they fought for tyranny. He thought to himself for a few more seconds, then sighed. Darren. Not so different from what I told you, is it? The first letter's the same, Rhys snarked. Desmond, Darren, what's the difference? Only literally every letter but one. I guess there's an in both, but that's really pushing it. Ignoring Darren, he turned to the trash heap. The girls were safe, and the Demon King was outmaneuvered. It was time to get down to his real reason for being here, the trash. Rhys wandered around the heap, picking things up, then putting them down. The more he inspected, the deeper the frown on his face grew. This stuff was trash. That was fine, of course. He loved trash. No problem with that. But the problem was, he'd been promised fine artifacts that were treated as trash, not actual pure trash. This was just trash. There were priceless artifacts, sure. Or rather, the remains of what had once been priceless artifacts. There were shards of fine glass, shreds of expensive parchment, and so on, but everything valuable had been destroyed to the point that there was no recreating them. This wasn't the pile of useful artifacts that could be used by him or his men equally, but a bunch of trash useful to him alone. He didn't mind, really. But it was something of a letdown. His promised stash was not the glittering treasure of his dreams, but simply higher-class trash. Higher-class trash. Rhys raised his brows, thoughts forming in his mind. He picked up a shard of glass and hurled it with all his might at a rock. The rock shattered. The glass pierced into the earth without breaking. Rhys waved his hand, and it shuddered, then answered to his call, flying out of the earth and back to his palm. He looked at it appraising Ly, then nodded slowly. That was high-quality trash. It was just as responsive as ordinary trash, but it had the solidity, strength, and power of the artifact it had once been a part of. Sure, broken into its component parts, it was probably infinitely weaker than the original artifact, but compared to the trash Rhys was used to handling, it was far more powerful. And there's also, he called out to the glass, activating trash intent. The glass trembled. For the first time, it didn't attempt to take form. Instead, it called out to the rest of the heap, and 1,000 points of trash lit up in Rhys's mind. Oh, interesting. He lifted his hand, calling all those thousands of points to his hand. As they flew in, the trash intent gave them shape. The glass shards came together, taking on a strange, bead-like shape, an orb with bands tightened around it, as if a watermelon's spines were pressed into the fruit instead of painted on its surface. A nose of sorts pushed out of the front of the bead, narrowing it like the neck of a gourd. Rhys blinked. Huh. The object spoke to him, trash intent telling him what it was meant to be. A storage artifact. No, more than a storage artifact. It was meant to suck up rivers and transport them elsewhere, then set them free again. A storage artifact for living waters. A weapon to unleash the full wrath of a flood upon one's enemies. Whichever way he viewed it, it was a monstrous construction. Truly worthy of being a legendary artifact. But even as he reformed it with trash intent, he could sense that its magic had not returned. He frowned. Before, he'd been unable to reconstruct artifacts if he hadn't been able to pay the initial price to return the magic as well, which he definitely would not be able to pay even if he burned all the trash in his star, and all the trash in this pit, too. Not for this level of artifact. But this time, he'd been able to simply reform its physical shape, without recalling the enchantment on it, too. And not only that, but the pieces had called out to one another. That part, he was willing to put up to it being a legendary artifact of some kind, but the magic. His eyes widened. Wait, is this how the Empress practiced her decoring techniques? She forced the enchantments out of these artifacts one at a time, maybe even practicing so that she wouldn't break them, or even the enchantment, when she removed it. It was her objective with cores, after all, to remove them without shattering them. It made almost too much sense. He delved deeper into the glass orb's intent, calling out to the magic it remembered having. In his mind, he could feel it, almost taste it, he could see its immense might as it unleashed waves upon a city, or its delicate side, as part of a river was removed, then diverted to run along a drought-stricken town. But the shape of the magic, the way the spell was bound into the material, how to circuit it through the orb to create the spell, the path and comprehension behind it, all of those were locked away from him, as if they had been completely stripped from the object. He released the trash intent and sent the shards into his core, more convinced of his guess than ever. If it wasn't completely true, it was at least partially true. This trash heap wasn't only hidden because of the artifacts, no, rather, it wasn't at all hidden because of the artifacts. The artifacts were inert, and the Empress was completely unworried about anyone getting their hands on them, and the few that had survived were of no particular interest to her. The water's fire mana battery was no threat to her, and didn't need to be destroyed. This trash, if his guess was right, then this trash was hidden because it was the Empress's practice material to learn her core removal art. But why? Why hide it? It was useless to anyone but Rhys, and it wasn't like other people had trash intent to call out to the trash and realize the enchantments had been stripped. Sure, he was sure other people could sense that the enchantments had been removed, but he let the idea play out in his head. An enchantment expert found this place. Found that the artifacts were not only destroyed, but their enchantments ruined. Then what? How was that dangerous for the Empress? He supposed he could see it being problematic for her undefeatable, perfect, utterly unique image, if others could see the result of her trying and failing to create the core technique before she succeeded, and maybe if someone could replicate her technique from seeing her practice, that could be a problem, but, no, even then, he didn't understand it. He looked at all the trash before him. Why hide it? There had to be a reason. Maybe it really was only for pride and propaganda, but there had to be a reason. He took a deep breath, then pulled, calling the trash into him. He'd study it all, take it with him and look into it until he could figure it out. You could ask, Darren suggested. You could eat my ass, Rhys returned. If it's all the same, I'd rather not. I concur. He was going to use his question for something useful, not for this. If he came up against a dead end and he couldn't break through, then he'd ask Darren, but not a second beforehand. This was a puzzle he had all the pieces to, as long as he could figure out how to put them together. He'd save his question for something he'd been puzzling on a long time without any hints. Straw, for example. The void. Either of those, Darren had far more knowledge than him, and a unique ability to impart knowledge. When it came to straw, the Demon King had made the remnant weapons, back when they were just weapons, nothing remnant about them. If anyone knew how to find straw, it was him. When it came to the void, he'd posited himself as an expert on it, and allowed Rhys to question him on it. He was annoying, but Rhys couldn't deny that he'd learned a lot about the void by questioning him. He'd demonstrated a unique knowledge of the void, and therefore, his knowledge on the void was worthwhile. This was something they'd both just come across. Darren knew little more than him. Sure, maybe the man had figured out something he hadn't, but it was just as likely that Darren knew nothing about this, and was just putting on a good face so Rhys would ask him, and he could honestly, without holding anything back, say that he knew nothing. Yeah, I'm not falling for that one. Unless I really run out of ideas, and he's the only hope I have left. Rhys walked the land, calling the trash to him. Despite being in the void did not want to cooperate here and assist him in pulling the trash in, so he had to wander the heap to absorb it all. That, too, was something he had to look into, but the Empress's practice grounds took priority. She'd specifically hidden this. It had to mean something. But what? If your world has no magic, how did you come to this place? Rhys turned. Darren was still following him, though with an unconcerned expression on his face, as if he wasn't interested at all in what Rhys was doing or had to say. His question, on the other hand, suggested the opposite, that he was very interested in Rhys, and still pondering over what Rhys had said. Rhys raised his brows. Really? That was all it took to get under his skin. Then again, what had he said? He had nothing left but knowing, or whatever. For a being who couldn't touch or interact with the world, and maybe even couldn't speak with anyone but Rhys, for a being who was proud of his knowledge to the point that he'd characterize himself as a being who knew, it must be incredibly frustrating for him to encounter something he didn't know at all. Despite himself, he grinned a little, pleased to finally have something that annoyed the man as much as the man annoyed him. He crossed his arms and gave Darren an appraising look. How about it? Would you like to guess? I'd say double or nothing, but I'm back to one question, so how about this? I'll give you 2 chances to guess. If you get it on the first, that's it, no questions for me. If you get it on the second, I keep my 1 question. If you don't get it on the second try, I get 2 extra questions, for a total of 3 freely answered questions. You're very confident that I can't guess it, Darren said. Rhys smirked mysteriously and cocked one eyebrow, saying nothing. It wasn't that he was confident Darren couldn't guess it, well, that wasn't right. He was confident Darren couldn't guess that absolute existence had mistaken Rhys for a god and yanked him into this world to deal with the trash problem, mostly because who in their right mind would guess that? But on the other hand, if Darren did guess it, even partially guess it, even guess at the existence of absolute existence, or even better, knew about absolute existence, it told him so much about the Demon King, and about this world. It was worth wagering his 1 question to discover that. In fact, if Darren got it right, it would essentially be a straight answer that Rhys wouldn't have any other way of discovering. In other words, the exact same kind of thing he would use his question on, anyways. He wouldn't mind getting 2 more questions instead of essentially using his 1 question here, but he also wasn't going to turn down a win-win gamble that he literally could not lose. He only had the option of winning, or winning more. Darren fixed him with a stare. I know what you're doing. I only like it when I'm the one on that side of the equation. Yeah, but you'll never know if you don't guess. If you do guess, even if you get it wrong, I'll tell you afterward. If you think about it, you're the one in a win-win situation. So you do feel like this is a win-win. Uh-huh. What are you gonna do about it? This is beneficial to both of us. You can refuse the deal, but you'll be harming yourself just as much as you're harming me. Darren narrowed his eyes. I don't like how you're so smug about it. And I don't like your attitude in general, so the feeling's mutual, Rhys retorted. At the height of my power, I would have you executed for that. But you aren't, so I'm mouthing off to you and there's nothing you can do about it. Darren glowered at Rhys. Rhys beamed. No, I take it all back. All my dead notebook-level scheming was pointless. It was all worth it just for this moment. Just for being able to smugly grin at the Demon King and know that he had that annoying man over a barrel, all worth it. You are insufferable, Darren grumbled. Yeah, but I'm not insufferable enough to get an entire nation to band together to overthrow me, so you've got me beat there, Rhys returned. Darren laughed darkly. Do you honestly think that is why they overthrew me? Yes. A dead stare. It's why I joined the overthrow Darren crew, anyways, he clarified. Did you consider that every person in a country might not be as petty as you? Rhys fixed him with a deadpan stare. Have you met the average citizen? Darren paused at that. Well, no. I was king, you understand. Ah, right. The average citizen, my liege, is a petty-ass being. And you are one of the most annoying people I've ever had the misfortune of encountering or knowing about, Rhys informed him. Darren blinked. You'd overthrow my country, if I still had one, because I'm annoying. I mean, I assume you were also being an asshole and repressing people and making them pay taxes and stuff, but yeah. Yeah, I would. And I'm not the only one. I never considered, Darren murmured to himself. I surrounded myself with philosophers. Oh, did you? I couldn't tell. And other wise men, thinking I would expand my horizons and grow as a person. But perhaps I grew in the wrong direction. Rhys raised his brows. He looked at Darren. I didn't expect introspection from you. Why not? No, you're right, you clearly think about yourself a lot. Darren paused. The two of them stared at one another for a long time. At last, Darren sighed. You really hate me, don't you? Hate isn't the right word, not yet, anyways. You frustrate and annoy me, though. Keep it up, and you're on your way to hate. I have found hate inescapable for much of my life. I thought it was my opinions and beliefs, but perhaps my personality also played a factor, Darren allowed. Perhaps, Rhys allowed. Darren waved his hand. Your qualms about my personality are neither here nor there. At hand is our wager. You receive 2 questions if I cannot guess, or lose your questions if I can. Right. 2 more, for 3 total. And I keep my question if you can't get it on the first guess, but you don't give up any more questions if you get it on the second. A heavy sigh left the man's lips. His blood-colored eyes burned into his. I shouldn't take this wager. Were I still alive, I would not. But a life immaterial is a life dull. At least I might feel a little thrill. At that, Rhys softened a bit. Can you talk with anyone but me? No. It's the book, isn't it? Another sigh. You already know. Why are you asking me? Rhys spread his hands. Ordinary people like confirmation. We like chatting and getting to know one another, unlike you big-brained philosopher people. Is it such a crime that I shared the company of philosophers? Shared the company? No one can be blamed for that. You never know who is and isn't a philosopher. Sometimes, you're just talking to someone, and suddenly bam! They spit out some philosophy. That's not your fault. You didn't know. But you sought them out. Deliberately found philosophers to speak with. That's the part that gets dicey. Darren squinted at him. I feel like what you think of, and what I think of, when we say the word philosopher, is not the same concept. Oh, probably not. They were probably less annoying and holier than thou in your era. Darren waggled his hand. Then why'd you think it was a good idea to hang out with them? Rhys asked, a little exasperated. In the books, they said it was a good way to expand one's mind. Were the books kind of annoying and holier than thou? Darren raised his brows as if a thought had just occurred to him. See. Written by philosophers, to promote philosophers. Can't trust them philosophers. They're just some guys who want to sit around all day, say useless things, and sound wise while everyone else works to support their lazy asses. Darren snorted. He looked at Rhys. What have philosophers done to you? Did they hurt you as a child? Fucking made me listen to his useless bullshit, then did no work on the group project, then acted like he'd saved all our lives by spouting nonsense at us and wasting everyone's time. Wish I'd punched that bastard in the nose. Would have learned him something all that philosophy bullshit didn't. What's a group project? I imagine it's what they make you do in hell, Rhys said. Darren snorted. He waved his hand. Give me a moment to think while you gather your trash. Rhys nodded. He walked on, strolling along the realm. He'd only been here a few minutes, and he didn't really want to leave until he'd puzzled out at least a hint at what the Empress was trying to hide by putting all this trash out of sight, so he was in no rush. Right now, he was using the tried and true technique of putting it on the back burner of his mind to simmer. If active thinking couldn't figure it out, maybe letting his semi-conscious mind chew on it would. He'd worked out all kinds of problems this way, from interpersonal to homework, and it had rarely failed him, though he wasn't sure he had the overnight time to really put his unconscious mind to work on it in his sleep that he usually would. I really need examples of what the Empress didn't strip of its enchantments, Rhys thought. He had plenty examples of what did, but as for what didn't, his only example was Logan Waters' mana battery. With one example, he couldn't corroborate anything. Was it because it was too simple? Because it was a mana battery? Because it was too low level, and below her notice? Had she just whoopsied and missed it? If he had multiple examples of what she'd ignored, he could at least start piecing things together, but with one, he simply knew nothing. Not only that, but the only example he had was also hearsay. For all he knew, Logan had made up a story about finding it here, and it was all bullshit that wasn't worth the time he'd already wasted thinking about it. He extended his mana senses as he sucked in all the trash, searching for any mana signals. The one good thing about everything being drained was that anything with mana was something the Empress had left behind, by necessity. The bad thing about everything being drained was that nothing had mana. He kept wandering, continuing to search. Darren walked at his side, mulling over Rhys's puzzle. What's up with your hair, by the way? Rhys asked. Darren asked. It's all greasy, but you're immaterial. Couldn't you just think that you had clean hair, and it would be clean? It's greasy. Isn't it normal? Darren asked. Rhys furrowed his brows at Darren. Is this an Emperor's new clothes kind of situation? Did no one tell you? Or were hygiene standards just different, back in your day? I washed my hair once a year, as was standard. Any more would be to invite the lice in. Rhys blinked at him. You mages had lice back then. Not mages, no, but mortals. Don't you have some habits from your mortal life? Rhys chuckled. If only you knew. He had more bad habits from his old life than from his mortal childhood here, but he supposed Darren had a point, for once. He still felt a little gross when he didn't get a daily shower, even though magehood kept him fresh as a daisy for weeks, trash stench aside. But that was because of his chosen path, not because it was difficult to get a hand on soap around here. I could make it less greasy, I suppose. But I'm used to this appearance. It would be strange for me to appear otherwise. Rhys glanced at him. I don't want to take your only joy from you. HMPH. You think that's my only joy? One of your few joys. Alongside tormenting me. Fair enough. A glimmer of mana brushed up against the limits of Rhys's perception. He extended all his energy toward it, narrowing in on it. It was faint, only a bare drip of mana, a single spark, but it was the first mana he'd sensed the whole time. Rhys approached it steadily, absorbing trash as he walked, but leaving the glimmer of mana. He couldn't see what he was avoiding absorbing, but he could feel it, and trash manipulation was high enough level now that he could manage that kind of finesse in his sleep. He was a long ways away from that child in the trash heap who'd struggled to sort the good trash from the bad with his bare hands. You're not a child of heaven, Darren murmured. Nope. Is that a guess? It is not. Don't be pedantic. Rhys shrugged. The trash had cleared away from the item, and he crouched to get a better look. Dusting off the last of it, he revealed an orb, about as large as the one Logan had somehow put inside his body. A mana battery. This one glimmered with blue light, with the cool energy of water. He picked it up gently. The battery was not full, and as if its strength were tied to its fullness, its glass walls felt as delicate and easy to pop as a soap bubble. The bindings on the mana were decayed, but not broken. The Empress had attempted to destroy this, but couldn't. Rhys's heart beat faster. He held the battery as carefully as he could, afraid his hand, trembling in excitement, might shatter the delicate thing. This was it. The hint. The secret. But what does it mean? Of course, he assumed that the bindings were weak because the Empress had attacked it, not merely because it was old and worn out, but it was a start. A start he had to believe in, because he had nothing else. A different realm. Rhys stared at Darren. What? You came from a different realm. One of the myriad realms beyond this small realm. What do you mean by realm? Rhys asked, squinting. In a way, it was true, but in a way, it wasn't. Darren gestured. In the darkness beyond this world, there are many other worlds. You come from one of those. Perhaps through some mechanical means. Nope, not like that, Rhys said. He turned back to the mana battery, but Darren's words echoed in his ears. A different realm. Myriad worlds, floating in darkness. The mana battery, delicate as a soap bubble. The Empress, pulling cores. Something tied them all together. Come on, you can figure it out. What is it? Rhys stared at the mana battery. Thoughts whirled through his head. Other realms. This delicate battery. The Empress, stealing people's cores. The mana battery, which was the closest thing magic gear had to a core, which Logan had even used as a sort of pseudo-core, but which the Empress apparently couldn't grasp. Why? She'd come close. He could feel it. The mana battery was so delicate, with such a tenuous surface, like a Christmas bauble, as if a mortal could close their hand and shatter it with no effort. But she'd failed. Were these the first things she tried to use her technique on? Is that why she failed? It was possible. They were the first thing he'd tried to use a core scooping technique on. They were core-shaped, and core-like in terms of their content and purpose. But somehow, he felt like that wasn't why she'd failed. Surely she'd just turn around and try again. If she'd failed the first time, the Empress didn't strike him as the kind of person to give up and go home if she didn't get her way, but instead, the kind of person to doggedly try again and again until she succeeded. One didn't become a legendary conqueror by giving up, after all. So if this wasn't a first-time failure kind of thing, then what was the problem? Why hadn't she been able to take the mana out of the battery? He blinked. Wait, is that it? Is it as simple as that? She couldn't take the mana out of the battery. When she scooped cores, she took the whole core, the core and its receptacle, in one. The gaping wound in the place where his core had been was proof enough. That was exactly what made sense for her, it was what she wanted to do. Neuter her enemies and empower her people in one. But what if that was also a limitation of her technique? What if that was all it could do? Her technique could scoop cores, but it couldn't take masses of raw mana. She could remove enchantments, but not suck all the mana out of a battery. It explained why the battery's shell was so thin, too. She'd been scraping at it, trying to take a container along with the energy, but there was nothing to take. Or rather, a battery was already essentially a removed core. She couldn't take a core out of a core. A second later, Rhys snorted to himself. What did that get him? He already knew she could take cores. Knowing that she couldn't suck raw mana didn't really help him much. It meant he in particular didn't really have to worry about her core scooping technique anymore, since his trash pile was essentially a lump of raw mana, but he didn't know what else it would do for him or anyone else. I only just learned her technique's weakness. I can't expect to instantly know how to use it to maximum effectiveness in the same instant. It was already pretty useful to know that he didn't need any fancy techniques to dodge the Empress, he was immune by default. Beyond that, he'd have to think a little more and study it some, but he was sure he could figure it out. He still had time. How much time, though? How long until the counterattack? He sighed, wishing for the millionth time that Bast had given him a timeline, a date, a general frame of reference, anything. He got it. He understood. There were reasons he wasn't being told things. But man, it made living his life frustrating as hell. There were reasons he wasn't being told things, but there were also reasons he wanted to know things, damn it. The thoughts he'd been on the verge of having about the realms and the technique and the mana fell to the back of his mind. He hadn't forgotten them, but he hadn't been able to put together whatever he'd been cooking up, so he'd continue to simmer those thoughts on the back burner until something came out. Maybe nothing would. Maybe he'd have a sudden flash of inspiration. Either way, it was worth mulling over. The trash pile steadily vanished into Rhys's core as he kept walking. Darren walked beside him, considering his next guess. He was taking this whole business with the guesses very seriously, which amused Rhys more than anything else. He had already won with Darren missing his first guess, since he'd secured holding onto the question he'd already gained, and since he doubted Darren was going to get it, he had basically secured 3 questions already. It just felt so good finally being on the other side of the equation that he could barely comprehend that he hadn't come up with this idea before. Of course, he hadn't had anything to hold Darren's interest before, so he wasn't being fair to his past self, but still. Is it that you were summoned here? Darren asked at last. Summoned how? Rhys asked. By a spell. By the way people ordinarily summon greater, or in your case, lesser beings. Ignoring Darren's attempted slight, Rhys shook his head. Nope. Close, but no cigar. Darren wrinkled his nose in distaste. So, what is it? How did you come to be here? Rhys smiled and took a deep breath. In the world I come from, there's a worldwide information network where anyone can use a mechanical device to chat with anyone else with a mechanical device in the entire world. Ah, so you were an elite, Darren said disgustedly. Nope. Everyone has these things. I mean literally everyone. People you'd consider peasants and paupers. Even homeless people can access them at a library. Anyone in my world can talk to anyone else at a moment's notice. That sounds dangerous. Tell me something our world leaders haven't noticed. Anyways, I was chilling on a random message board when someone messaged me out of the blue. A guy with the username Absolute Existence. A username is a kind of pseudonym you use online. On the information network, I was using the username God_of_trash because I love trashy media, that is, stuff that's looked down on by the general populace and not literature. You don't have to explain every little thing, Darren snapped, but for all that he was acting irritable, he had an intrigued expression on his face. Anyways, I had the username, God_of_trash, and so, Absolute Existence must have mistaken me for an actual god, or something. I told him I love trash, and the next thing I know, I'm waking up in this world, in this body. This isn't your body. Are you certain? Darren asked, shocked. Rhys nodded. I was 30 and morbidly obese in my world. I was put into the body of a starving child in this one. I'm very certain. But, if this isn't your body, your soul and body should be rejecting one another. I tried many experiments, but I could never fuse a soul into another body. And I'm piecing together why you got overthrown, Rhys commented. And yet, no rejection. You're perfectly fused into this body. As if this were your natural, God's given body, Darren slowed. He wrinkled his brows and pinched his chin thoughtfully. Absolute existence. It was one word. With a single E, Rhys offered helpfully. Perhaps the philosophers were right. Perhaps I did trod unto the domain of gods, Darren murmured to himself. He nodded at Rhys. Thank you. Your explanation was illuminating. For the first time since gaining the upper hand, Rhys suddenly felt as though maybe he'd been the one played, as if Darren had been the one to win in their exchange of wits. He narrowed his eyes at Darren, then slowly smiled. I suppose this is what that old saying about two old foxes, smiling at one another, means. Both of them had gained the upper hand. They'd just done it in different ways. Don't forget, you owe me 3 straight answers, Rhys prompted him, and was pleased to see Darren's smug expression falter a bit. He reached out and thumped the guy on the back. I can't be that hard. Everyone else gives me straight answers all the time. He stared at Darren. Darren stared at him. Slowly, both of them looked at Rhys's hand. I touched you, Rhys said at last. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.